Today's video is brought to you by Card Kingdom, and right now you can get this sweet Scoop Soldier sticker when you order over at cardkingdom.com. Just mention in your order notes that you want a Scoop Soldier sticker when you go to checkout. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for a super special video. So yesterday, we got one of the biggest and perhaps most surprising banned and restricted announcements in the entire history of the game. So there was no BNR scheduled for yesterday. Instead, just randomly on Wizards' website at 10:30-ish Eastern time, all of a sudden this huge list of banned cards popped up out of the blue. And if you're familiar with how bannings work, normally these days, Wizards gives us like a week notice and says like a week from now we're going to change things in this format. So this is, I guess, what I would consider an emergency BNR, because there was no warning, there was no announcement of the announcement. It was just like, okay, these cards are banned, and not only are they banned immediately. We are implementing the bans today on Magic Online, on Magic Arena, in paper as well, if you can play paper right now. So today, we got to talk about this BNR announcement, because it is historic and basically unprecedented in the entire history of Magic. So first off, we're looking at the BNR right now. What actually got banned? And the list is pretty long. Standard, Wilderness Wreck, Gross Spiral, Teferi, Cauldron Familiar, Pioneer, Inverter of Truth, Kessis, Walking Ballista, Underworld Breach, Historic, Wilderness Reclamation, Teferi, Time Raveler, Brawl, who cares, but also Teferi, Time Raveler. So the most important thing of this announcement is it is an announcement that shows, I think, a couple of things. One is, my opinion is, it shows that Wizards was having some big issues with people actually playing Magic. We've heard anecdotal reports, and I guess some of them are pretty objective at this point, of like Pioneer events just not firing on Magic Online. I know I was talking to Grim and he said it was taking like 10 minutes to get a single league match. The big weekend challenges were not firing. So obviously interest in Pioneer was at an all-time low. When you can't get a 32-player, 64-player event with a high EV to fire on Magic Online, that's a pretty good sign that the format isn't doing well. Standard is a little bit harder to judge. My guess is Wizards saw very weak numbers on Arena for Standard, with people just not playing the format, and I believe this is what pushed Wizards to take this action. The second thing is, this is a no half measures BNR. I was worried that when we finally got Pioneer bans, we would get like, oh, Dig Through Time is banned. Let's see if that's enough to power down the combo decks. Or in Standard, oh, Gross Spiral is gone. But Wizards went all the way. This reads like essentially a wish list of players of the cards that they wanted out of the format, and Wizards just got them all at once without any questions asked. So this is a huge announcement. We've never really seen anything like it before. The only somewhat comparable time in Magic's history is all the way back in 1998, 1999 during Urza's block, when there was a ton of cards banned from Urza's block in Standard. But this is essentially unprecedented in the history of Magic. So our focus for today is going to be, what do these bannings actually mean for the formats that were targeted by bans? What's leaving the formats? What might be coming into the formats? Have these bannings actually fixed the formats? Are we going to be dealing with this again in a few months? That's what we're talking about today. So anyway, let's talk banned and restricted announcements, starting with Standard. So if we look at the cards banned in Standard, Wilderness Reclamation, everyone knows about it. It was just 55% of the last Pro Tour. Gross Spiral is close to like 55% of decks overall. It just sees playing everything. Teferi sees a lot of play, is super obnoxious, shuts down interaction. Cauldron Familiar is kind of the dark horse. If you remember, a few weeks ago, we did a video called Will Rotation Fix Standard? And one of the things we talked about is Wilderness Wreck, Gross Spiral, Teferi leaving the format. So in essence, what most of this BNR announcement did was speed up rotation for some of the most important cards in the format, because Wreck, Gross Spiral, and Teferi, we're all going to be naturally leaving the format in like 6 weeks. So the upside is we get to play without them now, hopefully making Standard fresh and new. The kind of dark horse here was Cauldron Familiar. Cauldron Familiar is a one card that wasn't going to rotate in September that still got the ban hammer. I think this is most likely because the Sacrifice decks were the other top tier deck of the Standard meta, and if Wilderness Wreck goes away, and if like Bant Ramp, Teferi piles go away, it might just be that the Sacrifice decks are the next decks that's like 50% of the meta, and I think Wizards wanted to try to head that off and avoid it. I don't think most players are going to miss having Cauldron Familiar around in the long term. So if we look at the standard metagame page, we can get a pretty good idea of just how impactful these bannings are. Just look at the most played decks in the format. Team Rec, 4-color Rec, gone. The top 2 decks in the format, they're essentially one deck. That's like 30% of the meta, even more at pro level events. Bant Ramp, greatly diminished with Ghost Spiral and Teferi leaving. Rakdos Sacrifice, Cauldron Familiar is gone. Jund Sacrifice, Cauldron Familiar is gone. Various control decks play Teferi, get powered down a bit. Sultai Ramp gets powered down a bit. If you look at the top 12 decks in the meta, the only ones that really survive unscathed are mono-colored aggro decks, mono green, mono black, mono red. And you might think, okay, well, this is going to be a problem. We're just going to have a meta where it's these 3 mono-colored aggro decks at the top of the meta. But I'm not sure that's true, because the big reason that decks like mono green, mono red, mono black were so popular in our format is they were kind of the foils, more or less, to Temur Reclamation, Bant Ramp. The idea was you could get in underneath those decks. Your opponent, yes, they're going to win the long game 100% of the time, but if you can kill your opponent before they get to their Wilderness Wreck into Expansion Explosion, or their Bant Ramp Uro into Nissa into whatever, then you can actually pick up wins in those matchups. So I feel like with those top tier ramp / combo decks out of the format, that's actually going to power down some of these aggro decks a little bit, because the main reason to play them was beating decks like Temur Rec. Without Temur Rec to beat, then maybe they just become normal decks, or worst case, your decks can play some Wrath, play some removal to focus on them. So basically, the standard meta is almost completely new. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that standard is fixed, quote unquote. There's still some very powerful cards in standard. Uro, Embercleave, Ugin the Spirit Dragon. These are cards that are still in the format and surviving rotation. If we take a more short-term view, we have Nissas, we have Night Pack Ambushers, and the Flash decks may be getting better. We have Hydroid Crosses. We still have Mayhem Devils, which can certainly support the sacrifice theme, even without having Cauldron Familiar in the format. So there's still a lot of really strong stuff going on. So is standard, like, fixed? I don't think we know the answer to that. I think what I can say for certain is standard was essentially a dead format for me. I had zero interest in playing standard until we got to rotation, and now I have interest in playing standard again. It's almost like M21 is new for the first time. We have tons of cards to explore. We have tons of decks to explore. So is standard all of a sudden healthy now? I'm a little skeptical. We've had a lot of standard bannings, and most of the time what has happened over the past year is some other deck rises to the top, becomes 50% of the meta, 60% of the meta, 70% of the meta, then that deck needs to get banned, and we ban that deck, and then another deck does that again. So I feel like there are more fundamental systemic issues that might keep standard from being truly good, but even if a deck ends up 50% of the meta again, it's going to take a few weeks. So likely, this will get us through until Zendikar spoilers start in a few weeks, till we get to rotation a couple of weeks after that, and then we'll have a brand new format. So I feel like this is a short-term measure, and what's really going to determine the long-term health of standard is essentially what we talked about in that video about rotation. Does Wizards stop printing these busted cards that just do too much, are too powerful, and end up taking over the metagame? That we're going to have to wait and see for Zendikar Rising, for the sets after that, to see if Wizards has learned anything from this whirlwind of bannings in Standard this year. So I think Standard, good news is the short term is going to be fun. All of a sudden, it's essentially a new format. Most of the top decks have gotten banned. The ones that do survive were mostly top tier decks because they beat the other top tier decks that did get banned. So we essentially get a fresh start for the next 6 weeks heading into rotation. And then we'll have rotation, which is going to be another fresh start as a bunch more cards leave the format. In the short term, stuff that I would be looking out for if you want to find stuff to play. Some of the archetypes that I'm really high on, I think Embercleave is one of the biggest winners of this BNR. Embercleave is really powerful. Teferi is one of the cards that keeps it in check. Now it seems like it's probably going to be time for Embercleave to make its presence felt again. That could be Mono Red aggro, a nice budget-friendly option. It could be Gruul aggro, another good Embercleave deck. So I think Embercleave would be one of my picks for big standard winners. Another archetype to look out for is Simic Flash. Actually just Flash decks in general, but Simic or Dimir Flash. The thing is, these are decks that were very much held in check by Teferi. Teferi was like the I win card against these matchups. Like, if you stick a Teferi, the deck just can't execute its game plan. You kind of win the game Blood Moon style, let's say, or Ensnaring Bridge style, where you just take this 1/3 mana card, and it's like, hey, gotcha, free win. But without Teferi in the format, all of a sudden, Simic Flash loses its biggest enemy, and it might be time for a deck like this to shine, especially before rotation, while it still has all the pieces. The same is also true of Dimir Flash. Slither Wisp is really good. You get a lot of good pieces in Dimir. Blacklands Paragon, Lockmere Servant, better removal. Again, this is a little bit short term. Brindeboard Cutthroat's leaving, Spectral Sailor's leaving. What this archetype will look like after rotation, I have no idea, but for the next 6 weeks or so leading up to rotation, I expect a resurgence of Flash decks. The other archetypes that I'm really excited for returning, and these are archetypes that I think are going to be good pre and post rotation, is the Adventure decks. If you remember back last winter, last spring, Temur Adventure at one point was one of the best decks in the format, and the Adventure decks in a relatively fair metagame are very strong. You are not going to outgrind Temur Adventures very often. It has insane card advantage. It can tutor up whatever it needs. It grinds out a ridiculous amount of value with Edgewell Keepers, Lucky Clovers. So I expect this deck to immediately become a potentially top tier deck again, at least a deck that people are playing a lot, and because it's essentially very close to a Eldraine block deck, this is one that also survives rotation. So if you're looking for something to put together like on Arena or in paper that is hopefully going to be good immediately, but also be good after rotation in 6 or so weeks, Temur Adventure is a good option. The other even more budget friendly option is the Lucky Knights deck that we've played at various times in the past. This is another Lucky Clover deck, and I feel like Lucky Clover is one of the biggest winners too, kind of like Embercleave style. Adventures, Edgewell Keepers, Lucky Clovers. I'm really high on this style of deck. So this is another one that mostly survives rotation. There's even a Challenger deck that will give you most of the pieces for it. So I think those are the decks I would be keeping an eye out for over the next 6 weeks heading into rotation in Standard, along with all the other stuff that exists. We talked about the monocolor aggro decks. They're not going to go away. Control decks will still be around, but these are some of the dark horse decks, I would say, that I would definitely be keeping an eye on in Standard. Moving on to the Pioneer format, I think the bannings here might be even more impactful than they were in Standard. So Pioneer, if we look at its brief history, a little less than a year it has existed, it started off extremely hype, extremely fun, anything goes, and then Theros Beyond Death came around. It unleashed Inverter combo, Underworld Breach combo with Lotus Field, Walking Ballistic combo with Heliod into the format, and all of a sudden, the format was just all these combo decks. That was a huge percentage of the meta, and it just wasn't a format that many people enjoyed playing, which then we saw the decreasing play numbers, the events not firing. So something that I personally had been asking for is get rid of the combo decks, get rid of all of them. And Wizards did exactly what I hoped and then some. Inverter, gone. Underworld Breach, gone. Walking Ballista with its friend Heliod, that combo's gone. Kethis is a bonus. That was one I hadn't been asking for, but probably would rise up the ranks with the other combo decks gone. That one's gone as well. And if we look at the Pioneer meta, this is an incredibly huge deal for the format. I mean, yes, Mono Black Aggro is on there, but if you look at the top tier decks, and the decks that have been top tier for the last 6 months or so, consistently, Dimir Inverter, gone. Mono White Devotion, maybe it can still exist, but the combo was a big reason with Heliod and Walking Ballista that it was playable. That's probably gone. Lotus Breach combo, that one's gone. Kethis combo, is also gone. So this really shakes up the meta, and I think I am very high on where Pioneer is right now. If you look at the metagame, you don't see any more combo decks kind of hanging out, waiting to emerge to the top. I guess maybe you could consider something like Nio and Oda, like a pseudo combo deck. I don't even know if that really counts. There is still Wilderness Reclamation way down on the meta bin game page, but with no Nexus of Fate, so that kind of helps there as well. So I feel like we might be entering what I would consider a second golden age of the Pioneer format, because if we look at the decks that are likely to continue to exist, I feel like there's a reasonable shot, and fingers crossed this actually works out. It's really hard to predict such a huge shakeup. It's almost like a brand new format again, but I'm really hopeful that we're going to have a format where it's aggro versus mid-range versus control with a little bit of like ramp and like Winota style combo thrown in. Mono Black Aggro, obviously still going to be good. We have Saltai Delirium, also Niv to Light, powerful mid-range decks that are still going to be around in the format. And then we have like Esper control style decks, or Esper, I guess they're kind of like control slash mid-range depending on the bill. But I feel like we might actually have that rock, paper, scissors of aggro versus mid-range versus control, where you can play a whole bunch of different decks, and suddenly, rather than being a metagame filled with 50% combo decks or some ridiculous amount that was just not fun for most players, there's a chance that we're going to have this beautiful format again, where anything goes. You can play a whole bunch of different archetypes. If you're a control player, you got a control deck. If you're a mid-range player, you have multiple mid-range decks. If you're an aggro player, you can play mono black, you can play mono red, you can play affinity style and soul artifact decks. So I feel like it might be time for Pioneer to rise from the dead, and that is literally what it'll be, because Pioneer was very close to a dead format. We just got a BNR a couple of weeks ago where Wizards unbanned Oath of Nissa, which led to a huge uprising, outcry from the community about the format, the state of the format, their inability to enjoy the format. And Wizards, they nailed it. They fixed every single problem. They nailed every single banning in the Pioneer format. We can quibble like, oh, maybe Uro should have been banned somewhere in Standard and Pioneer, whatever. But really, there is not much to complain about with this BNR. This is essentially the player's wish list, or at least very close to my wish list for Standard and for Pioneer. So really great changes, and suddenly I'm very interested in Pioneer again. After not playing Pioneer in months, I'm back to brewing decks, playing the format, so I'm very excited for the state of Pioneer and very hopeful, fingers crossed, that these bannings actually will fix the format. Unlike Standard, where I'm kind of in wait-and-see mode, I think the Standard bannings definitely improve the format over the short term, and then we'll have rotation to shake things up. So I think the next few months of Standard will probably be pretty good, just because we're going to have this constant change. In Pioneer, I feel like Wizards really did get rid of most of the long-term problems, maybe all of the long-term problems, and that might lead to a really fun, healthy, enjoyable format that players once again are going to be brewing for, playing, joining events, and doing all that good stuff. Finally, really quick, wanted to mention the historic format. Historic Wilderness Rec. Oh my god, thank you, Wizards. I'm so glad Wilderness Reclamation is gone. That's a card that, it just really shouldn't exist. That was a mistake. I think this ban finally admits that. Teferi Time Raveler, I'm fine with that being gone too, just another mistake card. Although, Historic, heading into this banning, it was essentially a two-deck format. It was Wilderness Reclamation and Muxus-fueled Goblins. Those were by far the top two decks. Now we have one top deck, presumably, in Muxus Goblins. What does this mean? Does this mean we're just going to have a meta where like 50% of the players are playing Goblins or something? Which wouldn't actually be that much better than like 30% playing Goblins, 30% playing Temur Reclamation or 4-color Reclamation. I think, though, part of the reason why Goblins was so good when Wilderness Reclamation existed in the format is you really couldn't build your deck to fight Temur Rec and to fight Goblins, because they care about two very different things. Now, if Goblins is a top deck and has a target on its back, you can stuff your sideboard full of Tecatli Honor Guards, Hushbringers, Containment Priests, Grafdigger's Cages. These are cards that are insanely good against Goblins. So good. You could build a deck in Historic that will almost never lose to Goblins. The problem is, when we still had Wilderness Rec, if you build your deck to never lose to Goblins, you're always going to lose to Temur Rec. Or you build your deck to try to beat Temur Rec, which I think is way harder than beating Goblins, honestly, and then you're always going to lose to Goblins. So now I'm hopeful that if Goblins is just the clear-cut number one deck in the format, players can build their decks and their sideboards in a way that beats it. That'll knock Goblins back down, and maybe we get back to a healthy metagame in Historic as well. Plus, Historic's going to keep changing too. We got Amonkhet Remastered coming this month. We have Pioneer Masters coming this year. We have new cards from Zendikar that are going to be released a month after that. So even if Goblins dominate now, there's no reason why a month from now, as we lead up to Zendikar Rising releasing, Wizards can't just ban Muxus, and now we get another fresh start in the format. So to wrap things up for today, overall, Standard, short term, very excited. I think these bans definitely improve Standard immensely over the next 6 weeks. And then the 6 weeks after that, we'll have a shakeup with rotation in Zendikar Rising. So I feel like the next 3 or so months of Standard are going to be really fun. Because even if something is broken, it's going to take players a little while to find it, players even longer to realize that you can't beat it, and then ban it, and all that whole process. That process does take a little bit of time, even in a world of Arena speeding things up. So I'm very confident that the next 3 or so months of Standard are going to be really fun, going to be interesting, be way more wide open than we've seen in a long time. Long term, It still comes down to Wizards learning something. Like we talked about in the Whale Rotation Fixed Standard video, Wizards still needs to learn to not print Wilderness Reclamations, and Fires of Inventions, and Field of the Deads, and Okos, and Once Upon a Times, and Veil of Summers, and Teferis, and Growth Spirals, and oh my goodness, the list is so ridiculously long. So, long term, we still need Wizards to learn that lesson, and to stop printing the broken cards, or else Standard is probably going to be doomed to the same cycle of broken card coming out, eventually dominating the format, being banned, another broken card dominating the format. So short-term Standard, gonna be awesome. Long-term, fingers crossed that a lesson has been learned. As far as Pioneer, I'm actually pretty comfortable with saying I think Pioneer might be fixed now. Not just for the next few weeks, but over the long term. The big problem with the format was the dominance of the combo decks. The combo decks no longer part of the format. There's not any other combo decks that are on the cusp of being tier 1. I mean, who knows? It's a big format. Someone will probably figure out a combo someday. But for now, there's not an immediate threat of the next Inverter or Underworld Breach or Walking Ballista taking over the format. So I actually think that Pioneer went from close to unplayable to being one of the more healthy formats as a result of this BNR. And then Historic, one of the top tier decks gone with Wilderness Reclamation, which is great news. Teferi Time Raveler, whatever, get it out of here, it's a mistake card. Yes, there's a concern that Goblins might be too good, but the good news is Historic changes quickly, so if Goblins dominate, it's Historic. We can ban it a week from now, 2 weeks from now, a month from now, so it's not like we're going to be stuck like we were with Pioneer, with this miserable format for 6 months since Theros Beyond Death, whatever period of time, or Standard with Wilderness Reclamation for almost 2 years. So we're not going to get stuck like that, I don't think, in Historic, if the numbers show, and the players show Wizards, that Muxus is not healthy and Goblins are not healthy. I truly believe Wizards will get it out of the format, and I think that is a good way to wrap up this video. Maybe the biggest takeaway is, even though Wizards has made some big mistakes, even though formats have been in a really rough place at various points over the past year, this BNR does show 2 things. Wizards is willing to take decisive action. As I mentioned in the intro, this was a no half measures BNR. They went for the headshot, they killed the decks that were a problem, and we'll see what happens from there. But definitely huge props to Wizards for taking really decisive action on banning these cards. Secondly, it shows that Wizards listen to players. Like, the best example of this is the Pioneer bannings. The players told Wizards after the last BNR, where they unbanned Oath of Nissa, that they weren't happy with the format, that these were the problems with the format, and Wizards said, all right, we're going to listen to you. Our numbers don't necessarily show that Inverter is dominating or Underworld Breach is dominating, but when it comes down to it, the most important thing is y'all are having fun, and if you're not having fun, and you're backing up your complaint about not having fun by actually not playing the format, which we can see in our data, we're going to make changes even if we don't think the numbers show that. So Wizards showed not only are they willing to take decisive and fast action, which is something we've been asking for, but also that they're willing to listen to players. So I think that is maybe the most encouraging long-term thing from this BNR. Is Standard fixed? Who knows? Will Pioneer have another broken combo deck? Maybe. Will Muxus dominate Historic and have to be banned? Possibly. But the biggest good news is Wizards actually listened and was willing to take decisive action based on the feedback of the community. And that gives me a lot of hope for the health of formats going forward. So anyway, that's my take on yesterday's BNR. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.